In light of news events in America, there'll be no big breakfast this morning. Now we join Krishnan and Guru Murthy for a Channel 4 news special.
America under attack and in shock. The scale of the disaster is slowly coming into focus. Good morning and welcome to this special edition of Channel 4 News. Disbelief, terrible sadness and a quiet, unyielding anger. President Bush's response to the images that have stunned the world. This is the scene now in New York. Here and in Washington and Pittsburgh, many thousands of people are feared dead. The president has vowed to find those responsible.
The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
Cell phone calls from terrified passengers on board yesterday's hijacked airliners have revealed they were seized at knife point. In Washington alone, more than 800 are dead in the Pentagon. Government is closed, but promises to start again in the morning. And in the face of adversity, the search for survivors near the World Trade Center goes on as Britain pledges its support.
This is not a battle between the United States of America and terrorism, but between the free and democratic world and terrorism. We therefore here in Britain stand shoulder to shoulder with our American friends in this hour of tragedy.
This morning, more than 17 hours after the attack, the horror of the events has become clearer. The 4 aircraft strikes were launched with frightening speed. At 9:15 New York time, American Airlines Flight 11 crashes into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. At 9:03, as millions watched on television, a United Airlines jet slams into the South Tower. Then, with New York in a state of panic, another American Airlines jet crashes into the Pentagon, home to the Department of Defense. Soon after, a 3rd American Airlines jumbo crashes near Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. The towers were at the heart of New York's financial district. 50,000 people worked there every day. At 10:10, the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed. Half an hour later, it was followed by the North Tower. The official death toll has already climbed to over 2,500, and the message from the American President George Bush is one of resolve and inevitable retaliation. During the night, he assured his people, "Our military is powerful and it is prepared." Less than 24 hours ago, New York's famous skyline stood proud. Now its twin towers are destroyed. Manhattan is swathed in a mist of dust and many, many bodies surely remain under the rubble. Simon Israel reports on the terrorist attacks that America and the world will not forget.
The victims were in airplanes or in their offices. Secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror.
The opening words of a president addressing a traumatized nation last night in the wake of such apocalyptic scenes. 7 years to build, 63 minutes to raise the US symbol of economic might, the World Trade Center, to the ground. An act to show the utter fallibility of the world's greatest power. Officials say they're prepared to deal with thousands upon thousands of bodies. A thick mist of dust has shrouded a huge rescue mission which has suffered its own casualties. Estimates of 300 firefighters and 30 police officers, who were all among the first to the scene to help, are missing. They're believed to have been buried under buildings which crumbled in the aftermath.
I thank God that I'm safe. I feel terrible for the people that we lost, some of whom I talked to just 15 minutes before we lost them. And the city is going to survive. We're going to get through it. It's going to be a very, very difficult time. I don't think we yet know the pain that we're going to feel when we find out who we lost. But the thing we have to focus on now is getting the city through this and surviving and being stronger for it.
Overnight, there have been signs of people still alive, trapped or buried in the wrecked buildings. Cries for help have reached the outside world via mobile phones. 2,000 rescue workers are there, but the area is vast and dangerous. Official maps and building plans are of simply no use. The wreckage is so absolute, everything has to start from scratch. And while there's a desperate scramble to save life in New York, there's now a quantifiable reality of death at the Pentagon in Washington, the nerve center of the US military. Fires have been burning through the night along the scar left by the impact of a third hijacked passenger plane. 850 dead and another 800 missing. Details of this calculated offensive are only just emerging.
The following is a summary of the known facts surrounding today's incidents. American Airlines Flight 11 departed Boston for Los Angeles, hijacked by suspects armed with knives. This plane crashed into the World Trade Center. United Airlines Flight 175 departed Boston for Los Angeles, was hijacked and crashed into the World Trade Center. American Airlines Flight 77 departed Washington Dulles for Los Angeles, was hijacked and crashed into the Pentagon. United Airlines Flight 93 departed Newark for San Francisco, was hijacked and crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania.
Thousands of FBI agents are forging America's response to exact revenge. Crucial information about the worst terrorist attack in American history has come from calls made by a flight attendant and 2 passengers on 3 of the planes before they crashed. Each one told a similar story of hijackers wielding knives, taking control of the aircraft and somehow guiding them to their targets.
Well, live now to New York, and journalist Taimur Nabili, who was working in Manhattan when the attack took place. Taimur, they're working through the night. What's the latest information with you?
Well, as you've already reported, Krishnan, it's now a battle against rubble and against time, really. Hopes are there that there may be some people alive under all that rubble, and in fact they have pulled 2 people alive from the wreckage so far, believed both to be firefighters or members of the security services. One of them in serious condition had a limb amputated when they took him to hospital. But still, there is hope, but at the moment, not a lot to see. They've taken a lot of arc lights down to the World Trade Center because the electricity in that part of town has been cut off. People working through the night and lorries rolling back and forth, picking up debris and putting it away again.
And indeed, one of the greatest fears and regrets is that so many emergency workers appear to be buried in that rubble at the foot of where the World Trade Center was. One figure was saying around 300 missing.
That seems to be the figure that they're talking about now, but there really is no way of confirming that. The firefighters and the auxiliary police and some of the local police were the first into the building. Obviously, the response of the services here was very rapid indeed. About 200 to 300 were thought to have got into the building before the collapse happened. Among them, the head of the fire department, the chief of the fire department, and his deputy, both believed to have been killed in that wreckage. Firemen are held in great regard in this city, and the fact that so many of them have been lost is going to come as a major blow.
Difficult, I know, when it's in the middle of the night, but what can you say about the impact of President Bush's words to the nation earlier?
President Bush is playing it seems, very calmly at the moment. His words to the nation have been measured as most people were hoping they would be, but at the moment there has been some sense of underlying threat in that he said, and the talking point on most of the shows has been what he said about holding responsible not only the people that did this, but the people that give them safe harbor. How he will react in real terms is the question yet to come. A poll conducted by one of the networks here said that 86% of people questioned after the bombing would agree to going to war against whomever it turned out was responsible.
Taimur Nabili, thank you very much. Well, at 1:30 a.m. UK time, President Bush, finally back in the White House, addressed his bewildered nation via the television networks.
Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks.
Well, as the President appeals for resolve, attention is focusing on the U.S. response. Speculation has intensified around Osama bin Laden, the militant Islamic leader. A senior administration official said there was strong information implementing bin Laden and military options were being considered. The authorities want to search locations in Florida apparently connected to a passenger on one of the crashed aeroplanes who's believed to have been a bin Laden supporter. Jonathan Rugman reports on who might be behind the attack and the options a wounded America faces.
No longer a man in hiding in his own country, President Bush has returned to the White House. He said America was full of quiet, unyielding anger, that the hunt for the killers had begun.
We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbored them.
This is not the first time the World Trade Center's been attacked. In 1993, a bomb planted in an underground car park killed 6 people. The investigation which followed led to this man, Afghanistan-based Osama bin Laden, America's most wanted man. Bin Laden's also prime suspect for last year's bombing of the warship, the USS Cole, off the coast of Aden. Only 3 weeks ago, he warned that there would be an unprecedented attack on America and its interests. This is believed to be one of bin Laden's camps, surrounded by tanks of the Taliban militia. In a Channel 4 interview 4 years ago, he made clear his hatred of the United States.
I confirm that all the youth and the whole nation should concentrate their efforts on the Americans and the Zionists. Because they are the head of the spear that has been pointed at the nation and delivered into the nation's heart, and that every effort concentrated on the Americans and the Zionists will bring good, direct and positive results.
A journalist who spent 2 hours with him was given bin Laden's definition of terrorism.
Bad terrorism was terrorizing somebody without justification. Good terrorism was terrorizing an aggressor, an oppressor. He said there was no government nor civilization that had not used terrorism to target, to attack the corrupt. And he clearly referred to America as an oppressor, and that any form of terrorism was allowable.
Yet bin Laden's always denied any involvement himself, including the US embassy bombings in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam 3 years ago, in which over 200 people died. Then the Clinton administration hit back hard, bombing targets in Afghanistan and Sudan. Reports last night said Kabul had been pounded. The Pentagon said not by them.
In no way is the United States government connected to those explosions.
What about Osama bin Laden? Do you suspect him as the prime suspect in this?
It's not the time for discussions like that.
Can you talk to
In a hastily arranged press conference, the Taliban foreign minister said bin Laden was in Afghanistan, but not responsible for the World Trade Center attack. And those who've met bin Laden have their doubts.
He's highly intelligent, he has a good organization, but I wouldn't have thought that he was quite up to that sort of level of operation on his own. Now, we know that there is a cell structure of Islamic groups throughout the world, actually. So there is just that possibility that another country might have been involved in the planning.
Celebrations in East Jerusalem yesterday illustrated the depth of ill feeling towards America across the Arab world. But while it would be wrong to make a quick rush to judgment, Washington will eventually require force to be met with force.
While the Foreign Secretary Jack Straw is speaking now, let's go right over to the Foreign Office.
For the community in New York, for the people of the United States, and for the world's democratic communities. Very shortly, the Prime Minister will be holding a resumed meeting of the Emergency Committee to consider the security measures and the other implications of what has happened. Later this morning, I shall be travelling to Brussels, where there will be an emergency meeting of the Foreign Affairs Ministers of the European Union, again to express our full solidarity with the people of the United States, the victims of the United States, the victims and their families, but to consider the immediate implications for security and the wider implications. For one thing is certain, is that this is an event which has not only shaken the world, but also, tragically, has changed the world as well.
Foreign Secretary, will Great Britain be behind and indeed involved in any military action that the United States may take?
It's quite inappropriate right now for me to speculate on that publicly, but you heard the Prime Minister and you've heard all of us expressing the full solidarity of the United Kingdom with what has happened in the United States. And the truth of the matter is that this, yes, is the victims of this tragedy were in Manhattan, in New York, the immediate victims, but it's an attack upon the whole of the democratic world, upon civilization and humanity itself.
Are we perceived to be under threat ourselves as America's strongest ally?
The terrorist threats have been with us for a very, very long time, and many people here in London know directly about the threat of terrorism, and we recall that it was only a few years ago that there was a mortar attack just across the road from where I'm speaking, on Downing Street. A few years before that, an attempt by Irish terrorists, by the Provisional IRA, to take out the whole of the British cabinet in Brighton, just before the Conservative Party conference. We have to assess the risks, and of course we take account of the fact that we are close allies of the United States, and that this was an attack not just on the United States, but on the values which we hold as dear as the United States does.
Has Mr. Blair spoken to?
How important, Foreign Secretary, is it that the Western world keeps a cool head, respects those values, so acts on evidence, not impulse, targets terrorists, not civilians, and actually responds to this in a measured way that seeks justice, not retribution?
Well, of course it's crucially important that those who are in leadership positions, indeed everybody, should keep a cool head, but it's also profoundly important to recognise the scale of what has happened. There has been no attack of this kind on the continental landmass of the United States ever in its history, and I'd suggest that there has never been such a trauma in terms of casualties in the history of the United States since the Civil War in the middle of the 19th century. So it's about coolness, yes, but also an understanding of the scale of what has happened and the threat to the civilized and democratic world that has resulted.
Do you have any idea at this stage who was behind yesterday's attack?
No, we're speculation, but speculation, and of course it's one of the matters we are considering with great respect, more in private than in public.
What particular kind of support from Britain do you think would be most valuable, practical as well as moral?
Well, we should not underestimate moral support. The United States is the richest nation in the world. It's endowed with huge resources, and it's also endowed with such a strength of character. But the moral support, the solidarity, is of huge importance. And bear in mind that there are hundreds of thousands of people here in the United Kingdom who've got relatives and friends in the United States, millions who visited the United States, and I have to say, tragically, it is almost certain that there will be United Kingdom citizens, as well as other European citizens, amongst the dead and injured in Manhattan. So it's about moral support, it's about any other kind of support in the short term that we can offer the United States, but then it's about considering with the United States and the whole of the civilized world what further measures can be taken and how quickly they can be taken to try to reduce such a terrorist threat from happening in the future.
Has Mr. Blair spoken to President Bush?
He had not, as I left last night. He may have done overnight, but all of us have been sending messages of support and condolence to our counterparts in the United States, but all of us too understand that if we were in an equivalent position, our first tasks would be to ensure that there are proper facilities and services delivered to the injured victims, and then to clearance of the area, and then to other actions before we started to talk to our foreign affairs counterparts. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, the Foreign Secretary Jack Straw giving us the British government's perspective. Joining us now from his London home is the former State Department spokesman through much of the Clinton era, James Rubin. James Rubin, I hope you could hear some of what the Foreign Secretary was saying there. Put that together with what we heard from the President earlier. It's quite clear that military retaliation is on the agenda and possibly on the agenda soon.
Well, I think, first of all, we need to bear in mind, as Foreign Secretary Straw said, that this is an attack not just on the United States, and surely it is an attack on the United States, but on the entire civilized world. We're going to find not just British citizens, but Europeans, Asians, people from all over the world are going to be among the dead, because the World Trade Center is the symbol of international commerce, of international intercourse between nations. And so the civilized world has been attacked by the most evil kind of terrorism. And it's up to the civilized world now to get together and respond forcefully if necessary, but make clear their determination to root this evil out of the world so that this never can happen again.
And is that response primarily about rooting out terrorists, or is it about retribution?
Well, first of all, clearly this is an organization that, if it turns out to be the Osama bin Laden organization, that is determined to use the most cowardly form of terrorism to attack innocents again and again and again. They were responsible for bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, where hundreds of people from the United States and Africa died. They were responsible for attacks on the USS Cole. If they were responsible for this, we can be sure this isn't the last thing they have planned. So I wouldn't distinguish between retribution and reaction in the way you've suggested. These are people who are determined to use the most evil means to attack the civilized world, and until they're rooted out, all of us are at risk.
The President also said that America would not distinguish between the terrorists and those countries that harbour them. That's a very significant statement, isn't it? I mean, does that mean we could see attacks on civilian areas of nations that are regarded as harbouring terrorists?
Again, I wouldn't immediately go to a question about attacks on civilian areas. What we're talking about here is deciding whether countries themselves, governments, are acting, aiding and abetting the most evil kind of terror and using their government structures to permit terrorists to act in this evil way. And if it turns out that governments in Afghanistan or elsewhere are aiding and abetting the terrorists who committed this act, then they're equally responsible, and they must suffer the consequences to make sure that these kind of people never again can act in this barbaric fashion.
James Rubin, thank you very much indeed. Well, over now to our political correspondent, Gary Gibbon, who's at Westminster. Gary, what did you draw from Jack Straw, the Foreign Secretary's statements about where Britain stands with regard to whatever response is going to come now?
The interesting words there were that he wanted people to keep a cool head, he said, but at the same time recognize the scale of the trauma that America was suffering. Britain is very much walking a sort of tightrope here, trying to lash its fortunes and goodwill to the America in its moment of disaster, but at the same time hoping that as a reward further down the line, its calming advice might be listened to. The fear here is obviously founded on the 1998 experience, amongst others, when the East African embassies were hit, it's believed, by Osama bin Laden, and then the United States responded with attacks on a Sudanese pharmaceuticals factory, as well as some bases that were believed to be linked to Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. And the UK thought that was an inappropriate response. There was some unease about it. Now this time the retaliation could be even bigger, and Britain is hoping that by talking up, as Tony Blair was yesterday and Jack Straw was there, its affinity with the United States, it can be a sort of candid friend.
And it also appears that the Foreign Secretary sees Britain as having some sort of role in terms of bringing on the rest of world opinion, talking about the fact that the world has changed as a result of this.
Very much so. And those phone calls that Tony Blair was making yesterday to President Putin, President Chirac and Gerhard Schroeder were very much based on that. The guidance from Number 10 at the moment is that they think Tony Blair hasn't spoken to George Bush yet, but they expect him to speak today if he didn't manage a phone call overnight. And he'll be trying to convey to President Bush those conversations he's had with other world leaders and just trying to pull things together so America doesn't feel isolated, America doesn't feel that it can act without any consultation or regard for other countries' views.
How do we know so far how this is going to impact on the way the British government conducts itself over the next couple of days? The American government is effectively on a war footing. Tony Blair had to, of course, cancel his engagements yesterday. What do we know about what's going to happen next?
Well, conventional domestic politics is completely frozen on hold. But you did hear Tony Blair say in his statement in Number 10 yesterday that he wanted people to go about their normal lives today. We have not been the country that has actually been hit. We obviously have heightened security measures, not least if you're trying to catch a plane somewhere. But he doesn't want, for any number of reasons, this country to grind to a halt, as inevitably large parts of the United States will today.
Gary Gibbon, thank you. Well, the Foreign Office has issued an emergency telephone number for anyone in Britain worried about relatives or friends in the United States. It is 0207 008 0000. That's 0207 008 0000. Well, over now to Jasmine Lowson for some of the day's other news stories.
The TUC Congress resumes this morning in sombre mood, having been postponed yesterday because of events in America. The Prime Minister cut short his visit to the Brighton gathering, putting on hold an expected showdown over his plans for privatising public services. Tony Blair left the conference centre after promising to continue talks about his proposals at a later date. The winner of the Conservative leadership race will now be announced tomorrow. The 24-hour delay was confirmed by outgoing party leader William Hague as a mark of respect to the victims of the terror attacks in America. The result will be revealed in a simple statement.
Whoever has committed these atrocities has committed a monstrous act of war against the civilized world.
You're watching a special edition of Channel 4 News. It's coming up to 7:30. Our main headlines this morning. America in shock as more than 2,500 people are confirmed dead so far in yesterday's horrific terror attacks on New York and Washington. Hundreds of firefighters and police are among those killed. The Pentagon still smouldering. President Bush has addressed his shattered nation, putting his government on the highest alert. Britain has promised to help track down those responsible.
Very shortly, the Prime Minister will be holding a resumed meeting of the Emergency Committee to consider the security measures and the other implications of what has happened. Later this morning, I shall be travelling to Brussels where there will be an emergency meeting of the foreign affairs ministers of the European Union, again to express our full solidarity with the people of the United States, the victims and their families, but to consider the immediate implications for security and the wider implications. For one thing is certain, is that this is an event which has not only shaken the world, but also, tragically, has changed the world as well.
Well, all this also reveals the new era of urban warfare, and many analysts are saying that America's security agencies were looking in the wrong direction. According to the leading US think tank, the RAND organization, the US intelligence services have failed to move on much from the geopolitics of the Second World War. Until yesterday, the main enemy was perceived to be the nation state, not the international terrorist. Andrew Veach has this.
This is what the analysts call asymmetric warfare, the ability of the weak to take up arms against the strong. Forget missiles, forget rogue nations, forget national missile defense. This is 21st century warfare. Think of one man strapped to a bomb, think of hijackers. All too easy when security on domestic flights in the United States is virtually non-existent. They tried it back in 1994. Islamic fundamentalists hijacked an Air France Airbus in Algiers. They were tricked into landing at Marseille and were captured. Police found 20 sticks of dynamite under the seats. It seems the plan was to blow up the plane over Paris. 17 sailors were killed when the destroyer, the USS Cole, was attacked last October. Suicide bombers rode a skiff alongside while it was refueling in the port of Aden in the Yemen. But according to the influential RAND organization in Washington, America's ability to defend against and respond to terrorist attack remains inchoate and unfocused. Its thinking remains rooted in the Cold War. Its reliance on military force is counterproductive, and many in the military in Europe agree.
We need to step back and look at the long-term strategic consequences of these events, because what is certain is that the world will not be the same place again in the future. And I think we need to take a considered view about how we're going to respond. I think striking out with cruise missiles at suspected targets around the world is the last thing we should be doing at the moment.
But the worst thing that could happen would be for a kind of increase in the polarization consequent on this terrible disaster. We have to stand back and try and work out what are the root causes of the motivations of such people and what are the environments from which they come. If we don't do that, the net effect will be more of this kind of disaster in the future.
As it is, says the RAND organization, the cruise missile attack on the terrorist leader Osama bin Laden has served only to lionize him. If the United States is to counter the terrorist threat, it must first understand it.
Well, with me throughout the programme are Adel Darwish, who's a writer on Middle East affairs, and Professor Fred Halliday of the LSE, who's a specialist on the region. Fred Halliday, I mean, do you think security services have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of terrorism at the moment?
Security services can't predict everything that's going to happen. I mean, this is almost like an earthquake, and if you ask someone, can you predict all earthquakes? No, these things do happen, and the vulnerabilities are always there. I don't know to what extent security services have changed their targets, but in this country they've been concerned with the IRA, which is what they call a non-state actor, for many, many years. So I don't think that it's right to say that people have not been aware of these things. The real problem is that this operation has had one consequence. It's very simple. It can be done. And that really is the secret which up to now nobody has admitted to. But no amount of security services, no amount of warning in the world, unless you're going to close down everyday life, could stop this from happening.
Adel Darwish, so much speculation surrounding Osama bin Laden is predictable, and we don't know how much of that is based on fact. Do you buy it?
No, I wouldn't buy it. I think we should really stand back, watch what happened, assess and have good assessment. And it would be extremely foolish to go after Osama bin Laden, because if the CIA and security agencies and intelligence agencies say, we know now, we have evidence that person A or organization B has done it, then the big question is, well, if you have this evidence, why couldn't you predict it, or at least have some kind of preemptive strike before it happens. So we have to be extremely careful, because as we have seen in 1998, when you use cruise missiles, you only perpetuate the problem, you perpetuate the hatred against America and the Western world. So we have to act actually coolly. This, as Fred said, this is something totally new, like an earthquake, something you cannot predict. It's just you have to go for the roots of the causes of this problem and try at least to uproot it.
Well, stay with us, gentlemen, for now. Thank you very much. Now, the most appalling event the world has ever seen, whose repercussions will go on forever, the verdict of one leading psychologist on the global impact of yesterday's events. So how are the citizens of a proud and patriotic America starting to come to terms with it? Our Washington correspondent David Smith was on the West Coast when the unbelievable happened. He joins us now from San Francisco. David.
Not yet midnight out here on the West Coast, Christian, in front of the Bay Bridge in San Francisco, at the end of a truly excruciating and horrifying day for the United States. Made all the more so, it should be said, by reports that are now out in the morning papers here, depicting in grisly and appalling detail what appears to have happened on those planes before they came down. The newspapers are quoting passengers on board those planes before they hit the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, calling relatives and friends from on board those planes, saying that hijackers of Middle Eastern origin murdered stewardesses in front of the passengers and there to lure pilots out of the cockpit, and that the hijackers apparently had trained pilots with them who then went into the cockpits and flew those planes. The numbers of people dead, stories like that, the quite terrifying carnage in New York and Washington, one thing. The psychological fallout from all this, and that's what you feel out here, 3,000 miles away, on the other side of the continent. The psychological fallout from all this, quite another. San Francisco, like other major cities, deserted after what they're calling the Day of Infamy. And remember the last time this country said infamy, it was Pearl Harbor and entry into World War II. Flags at half-mast outside the closed Pacific Stock Exchange. Emotions so raw, as people did old-fashioned things like buying a special edition of the newspaper. When you see these pictures, when you see what's happened, what do you think?
It's unreal. It's just unreal. I mean, you always keep thinking that you're going to wake up and it's some funny movie or some novel that you've been reading and it will all go back to reality, and it's not real yet.
This is going to change this country, isn't it?
I would think
Forever.
so. It'll be very interesting to see how we deal with this. Are we going to put our head in the sand, or are we really going to try to figure out a way of making so this never happens to anybody ever again?
What does this do to you? I mean, is it anger or is it shock?
It was shock and a little sick, not angry. I can't feel angry right now. I'm over my anger. You know what I mean? When I first saw it on TV at 6 o'clock this morning, I was angry. But now, it just makes me sick.
Here, 3,000 miles from the World Trade Center in New York may be, but the state of siege all too evident, because one of the planes hijacked was bound for San Francisco. The monumental Transamerica building in the heart of this city, shut down till further notice for fear of replica attack. What do you want to see America do now?
Heal.
Heal.
Heal. Not too worried about retaliation or anything like that. Don't know who did it. So.
I think first of all we have to find out who did it and why, and respond very strongly. It's a great, terrible, terrible day for our country.
Even the Golden Gate Bridge, the ultimate symbol of California, the empire in its own right, even this closed at one point. America suddenly vulnerable in a way it's never been before.
Obviously, gut reaction says retaliate, but hopefully he takes into consideration that he has calmed down a little bit. But, of course, all Americans right now want to retaliate.
And as the president spoke, you could sense America rally. Anger tempered by the need now to unite and find common cause against the enemy, whoever that enemy might be.
This is definitely going to test his mettle. He's got to really step up to the plate, as they say here in the United States.
But behind the emotions, the reality now. The superpower that will never be quite the same after this. And I suppose, Krishna, more than anything, I mean, just look at the morning newspaper here today in San Francisco. Nightmare. The US under attack. To quote one leader column, our national security with its military might and vast network of intelligence agents is as illusory as a Hollywood set. Like Pearl Harbor, 1941, like JFK, John Kennedy's assassination in 1963, the leader column concludes, we will never be the same again because we are at war. Krishnan?
David, how much is the American nation going to take its lead from President Bush? How important is his stance now?
Oh, I think the next 24 to 48 hours, not just for this presidency, but for the country as a whole, is critical. And the kind of lead he gives, Krishnan, absolutely of paramount importance. I thought it was very significant tonight that he said there will be no discrimination between those who did this and those who harbour them. For those of us who've been here through the 1990s and watched the earlier response from Bill Clinton's administration after the attacks in East Africa, that was a clear signal to me that we should be looking, if it is Osama bin Laden, if it is Middle Eastern, we should be looking at Afghanistan, we should be thinking about Pakistan, because those who harbour them, I think he was giving us a clear signal that we can expect a response once they think they've got an address. What we need to bear in mind, Krishnan, is that those of us who lived here through that period also saw the United States attack, and there's pretty clear evidence on this one, attack a pharmaceutical factory in Khartoum, a factory producing penicillin. The consequences of this and the way Bush reacts, absolutely critical, but there will be no guarantee that the target is a valid one.
David, for now, thank you. Well, let's have a look at this morning's newspapers, and of course the dramatic pictures of yesterday's attacks make all the front pages in very dramatic form too. The Times shows the moments after the second devastating jet impact as debris from the plane and the South Tower is scattered over Manhattan streets. They say it was the day when war came to America. The Guardian leads with a similar image as flames engulf the upper stories of the two towers, claiming it as a declaration of war. The Daily Telegraph echoes that sentiment, claiming the attack is also war on America. They call the terror the most devastating in history. The Sun calls it a day that changed the world, the ultimate crime of terrorism. They too show the huge fireball caused by the second impact. The Mirror calls it a war on the world, claiming it as many as 10,000 people are feared dead. And the Daily Mail describes it as an apocalypse and pictures the moments after both the towers had collapsed as rubble and debris pours into the waters around Manhattan. Well, joining us now from Westminster is the Conservative Foreign Affairs spokesman Francis Maude. Francis Maude, is Britain's wholehearted support on whatever America does now taken as read?
Yes, absolutely, it should be, and I'm sure it is. This is not just an attack on America. America stands proxy for the whole of the free world here. And it won't just have been an attack on American citizens. There will have been citizens, people from all over the world, actually, working in the World Trade Center yesterday morning. And so there will be, as I'm afraid, as the news hardens over the days ahead, there are going to be families grieving all over the world for this immense atrocity that's happened.
And do you share this idea that it's changed the world?
Yes, I think what it does is make vivid how unprotected a free society is. That's one of the things that makes it free. There will be lots of questions about how security can be tightened up and all of that, but the world will not feel the same again. This is a shattering event. And what I think is so sort of astonishing about this is to imagine the organization that is able to get at least 4 people, and presumably more than that, into a position where they're prepared to commit an atrocity which not only condemns thousands, probably thousands of people to death, but actually involves automatic death for themselves. Now, that narrows down the kind of people who must be behind this. This is no ordinary organization.
And in terms of America's response, if America goes to war, Britain goes too.
Well, you know, talking about going to war, you need to know who you go to war against. It's not clear that there's a state behind this. There is clearly a significant organisation behind this, and I hope that Britain, I know that Britain will stand absolutely foursquare. We must be foursquare with America on this, because, you know, the whole free world is vulnerable by definition of being free. And so we have a joint common interest as well as a moral duty to stand with America, and Britain must do so.
But the American president has made it clear, in making no distinction between the terrorist organisations behind this and the nations that harbour them, America could well, in effect, be declaring war on a nation-state.
Well, if it's clear that the organisation that perpetrated this monstrosity has been harboured by other countries, then they must expect to be visited with an immense rage, and rightly so. There's been a lot of talk about how the response must be proportionate and all of that. But actually, the response to an atrocity of this hugeness and savagery is actually a response of very great ferocity. That would be proportionate. That would be the right way to respond to it. Obviously, the administration isn't going to leap into sort of hair-trigger response. I know the people who are at the head of the administration. These are people of great experience, very measured judgment, and you know, they're not going to behave like cowboys, but they are going to ensure that those who have committed this and those who have permitted this will regret it.
Francis Maud, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, the likely origin of the terrorist attack is focusing almost entirely on the Middle East, where anti-American rhetoric and actions have been loudest. Our foreign affairs correspondent, Gabby Rado, is in the Jordanian capital, Amman. Gabby, what has been the response there?
Well, I think what has to be said first is that all the governments in the Middle East, virtually all the governments in the Middle East, Israel as well as most of the Arab countries, have strongly condemned what happened yesterday in the United States. Israel, perhaps predictably, has gone the furthest. It's declared a day of mourning today to express sympathy for the presumed thousands who died there. Israel also closed its airspace to foreign planes. Obviously, Israel is used to being on a very sort of high state of security, and it's closed its airspace to foreign planes. It's allowing Israeli airliners into Israeli airspace because they have much higher security when people board, of course. They've been on this higher state of alert for decades now. The Israeli official line is that they assume that it's Islamic extremists who are behind these attacks. The Israelis, just on a more practical note, have sent reinforcements into the around the American embassy in Tel Aviv and the two consulates in Jerusalem. And as regards the Israelis' own embassies abroad, their staff has been reduced to a bare minimum, but the buildings are remaining open, presumably to help with queries and any emergencies. The official line, I mean, there's a kind of a grim feeling, I think, from Israel that in some senses we told you so. The statements that have come from Prime Minister Sharon's office has been that terrorism is contagious. If you don't stop it here, it will end up in the United States. And the one particular line that came out from one particular spokesman is that the terror we're facing starts with the Jews, but it never finishes with them. Now, as I said, across the region there has been widespread condemnation, including, some of the most vehement former enemies of America, Iran. President Mohammad Khatami in Iran has actually talked of his deep regret and his sympathy with the victims. One exception is Iraq. Again, perhaps predictably, Iraqi television has actually shown pictures of the World Trade Center towers falling down, and it played a patriotic song which had the words "Down with America," but there's been no other commentary from that. Now, as regards the Palestinians themselves, their leader very emphatically and very early on yesterday, Yasser Arafat, did put out a statement. He said he looked shocked, and he actually said, "We are completely shocked. It's unbelievable." He said, "We completely condemn this very dangerous attack," and he conveyed his condolences to all the American people and the American president himself. Even the leader of perhaps the one of the more militant Palestinian resistance groups, Hamas, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, also went on record as saying that this was not anything to do with his organization, and he said he wasn't interested in exporting attacks to the United States. He said we're not ready to move our struggle outside the occupied Palestinian land. Now, you probably have seen pictures of some Palestinians celebrating. That took place in East Jerusalem. I think the pictures we saw, that was, they had to be put into context. I think that was probably limited. It's probably before the full scale of the atrocity had actually reached the people there. There was 4,000 people apparently had come out in the streets of Nablus on the West Bank, and they did celebrate because they saw this as a blow against America, which indirectly a blow against Israel. The Palestinian Authority, their own people, the police, have actually detained TV camera, and they did not want pictures of these demonstrations going out. Krishnan, you were saying?
Gabby, thank you very much. Now, the repercussions of the disaster on America's East Coast have been felt around the entire world. Global economics, transport networks and communications of all kind have been severely affected. Justin Rolat has been trying to assess some of the changes so far, and he joins us now from the world's busiest airport, Heathrow. Justin.
Well, Heathrow today is actually unusually quiet. Because all the American airports are closed, there are fewer flights out of Heathrow, and indeed all international airports, not just in Britain, but across the world. However, other flights may be delayed because the British government has brought in new security controls. There are far more police than you'd normally expect to see here at Heathrow, and there are no international flights being allowed over central London. However, it's not just flights that have been disrupted. It's no understatement to say that this attack has caused chaos around the world. The hundreds of emergency vehicles mobilised in the immediate aftermath of the attack were dwarfed by the scale of this atrocity. As they struggled to take control of the immediate area, the world began to feel the impact of what happened on Manhattan Island at 8:45 in the morning. The US government took immediate action. All flights within the United States were suspended and planes ordered to land. All branches of the armed forces were put on alert. All telephones in Washington were cut.
Today we've had a national tragedy.
President George W. Bush left an elementary school in Sarasota, Florida, heading for a special command center in Nebraska before flying on to Washington. But the repercussions of this attack could not be contained by suspending flights and cutting telephone lines. This was not just an attack on New York and the Pentagon, but on the foundations of international trade. And as the Twin Towers collapsed, the entire world shook. The first effects were felt in international airports around the globe as all flights to America were grounded or even turned around in mid-flight.
And we were about 2 hours into the journey, I think, when the captain said that we had to start circling around because an event had happened on the eastern seaboard.
Did they say any more about the event?
They didn't. They just said there was a serious development on the eastern seaboard and no more planes were allowed into US airspace at that time.
As the news flashed around the world, people tried to comprehend what had happened.
We was hearing that Canary Wharf had been closed, that there was evacuating the stock exchange, and, you know, it was, for want of a better word, surreal. You know, you look around now, the roads are clear. The last time it was like this was Princess Diana.
Last night, bars and pubs around Britain were subdued. Most people headed home to try and understand what it will all mean. And trying to understand what it will all mean is exactly what the world's financial markets have been doing. The New York Exchange shut down after the impact. It will be closed again today. The London Stock Exchange saw the biggest fall since Black Monday in 1987. The market fell 6%.
Well, the reaction was pronounced, and despite calls for calm, it was fearsome. We saw a plunge in share prices. The benchmark index of Britain's largest 100 companies rapidly turned a 97-point gain into a 260-point loss.
As Americans cleared supermarket shelves preparing for the worst, central banks around the world are reported to be poised to flood the financial markets with emergency funds. But as Britain discovered during Black Monday, it is almost impossible to support a market in freefall. Justin Rolat, Channel 4 News.
Well, of course, images of the disaster from yesterday are surfacing almost by the hour. We can show you now the latest ones we've received of the first impact on the World Trade Center. This is sometime before And that is the image that we hadn't seen until now of the first plane going into that tower just around 9 o'clock in the morning, New York time. That smaller aircraft completely disappearing into the tower, and of course it was just a matter of minutes before the second impact happened. 8 o'clock, if you've just joined us, you're watching a special edition of Channel 4 News. Our main headlines this morning. The United States is in deep shock after the most devastating terrorist attack in its history. 2,500 people already confirmed dead in New York and Washington, D.C. The entire US government has been put on the highest alert. Major cities are on emergency footing, all international flights are grounded, and land borders closed. As the desperate search begins for survivors beneath the rubble, so too has the search for those responsible. President George Bush has vowed retaliation for evil, despicable acts of terror.
The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
It's emerged that some of the passengers rang their relatives from those very planes in the minutes before they crashed, and each had a similar story, like Mark Bingham on United Airlines Flight 93.
He just said, I want to let you all know that I love you very, very much in case I don't see you again.
I said that?
That the plane has been taken over by hijackers. And then I said, well, we love you very much too, Mark. Let me go get your mother.
While the 266 passengers who died on the 4 flights can be identified from passenger lists, it will not be as easy or as quick to confirm to families across the world the names of those who perished on the ground in New York.
Simon Israel reporting. So, how could terrorists have so comprehensively penetrated the defences of the world's most powerful nation? Let's recap on the scale of the attack. The 4 attacks were launched with frightening speed. At 8:45, collapse of that amazing New York landmark. Also in New York, the city's mayor, Rudolph Giuliani, has been touring the scene. He's already warned the number of dead will be unbearable as rescue workers work through the night and begin the desperate search amid that appalling debris. The news from that debris area is already grim. Over 300 firefighters and other emergency workers, around 70 police officers who had gone to help those people trapped in the World Trade Center have been killed, are certainly missing, trying to help other people. So, a day of unimaginable horror, a shaken America in deep shock after the worst terrorist atrocity in its history. Rescuers are digging for bodies in the still smouldering rubble in New York City and Washington, D.C., the very symbols of political power in the United States. The world's financial center, the seat of military might, all in ruins after the devastating attack by 4 hijacked aircraft. All international flights into and out of the United States are suspended, its cities put on emergency footing. It's been compared to a war zone. Well, it's an event that's changed the world, says the Foreign Secretary Jack Straw, an event that's changed the world's only superpower more than anywhere else. The unthinkable has happened, leaving a president and an entire nation in deep shock and outraged mourning.
Thousands of despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shatter steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today, our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks.
The official death toll so far has already broken 2,500. At the Pentagon in Washington alone, more than 800 people are feared dead. It's feared the final death toll will run into the many, many thousands. And all people, all the civilian passengers on those 4 hijacked airliners are, of course, lost too. We're back tonight with all the latest news and analysis on Channel 4 News at the usual time of 7 o'clock. There'll be major updates throughout the day and on our website. For now, from all of us, that's Channel 4 News.